Trump gave Putin 50 days to end the war. Now he's allegedly shortening that time to just 10. But on the front lines, no change is visible. Russia not only shows no readiness to end it, but is actually intensifying operations on the front as part of the ongoing spring-summer offensive, achieving noticeable progress in Donbas. Pokrovsk is already surrounded on 3 sides, and every expedition to the city is a roll of the dice with death. Weakened Ukraine, uncertain of Western aid, and above all suffering from chronic personnel problems, is forced to prepare for further pressure from the Kremlin's army. For this purpose, the Ukrainian Surovikin Line is being created, also known as the New Donbas Line, a new line of fortifications north of Dobropilya, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, which is meant to fulfill one fundamental task: stop the advance of the Russians, just as the Ukrainians were stopped by Surovikin Line in Zaporozhye in 2023. What does the situation on the front look like? Will the Donbas Line provide Ukraine with stabilization? Let's check on the map. Let's start with clarifying one thing. We have marked the extent of Russian progress from late May, when we last analyzed the front situation, with a bright dashed line. This way we can visualize the advances made by the Russian Federation in the last 9 weeks. It is clear that the Russian offensive continues to focus in Donetsk Oblast, though in recent weeks offensive actions were also observed in other areas. In the eastern part of the Zaporozhye Oblast, the Russians captured the town of Kamyanske, and shortly thereafter began fighting for the neighboring village of Plevny. This enabled them to strike toward Stepnohirsk. The outskirts and buildings of this locality were intensively bombarded, indicating preparations for an attempt to infiltrate Ukrainian positions by assault groups. The potential capture of Stepnohirsk would bring the southern districts of Zaporizhia within range of Russian FPV drones. Nevertheless, this is not a direction of key importance. Russian actions here are of limited character. The Russians also conducted operations southeast of Huliai-Pole, capturing the village of Malenivka by July 14th, merely trying to tie down Ukrainian units in this area. The main weight of the Russian offensive, however, rests on Donetsk Oblast, where the Russians are attacking in several directions. In the southwest, they have almost completely pushed Ukrainian forces beyond the border of Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk Oblasts, capturing dozens of villages on the eastern bank of the Vovcha River in recent weeks. Among them were localities including Vilne Pole, Shevchenko, Fedorivka, Komar, Yalta and Zaporozhye. Only Komyshuvacha, Oleksandrograd and Iskra remain under Ukrainian control, while fighting continues for Voskresenke and Zeleny High, the last one probably already captured by the Russians. In the Yalta area, Ukrainians conducted counterattacks, regaining partial control. Nevertheless, Russian successes opened the possibility for them to strike at the left flank of the Ukrainian positions in Zaporozhye, though realizing this goal depends on their offensive potential. While the Russian command is currently concentrating its attention elsewhere, in recent months it has repeatedly changed main attack directions, adapting to Ukrainian weaknesses. The fact is that the Russian offensive is prioritizing the northeast of Pokrovsk in order to cut off the city and the nearby town of Myrnograd from their supply lines. At the beginning of July, the Russians broke through Ukrainian defenses, capturing, among others, Razine, Fedorivka, Novotoretske, Boikivka, Mayak, and reached the buildings of the Krasnolimanska mine east of Rodynske. Simultaneously, fighting continues for Ekonomichne, which by July 25th had passed almost entirely under Russian control. From there, the Russians moved toward the northeastern districts of Myrnograd. The approach to Rodynske cut off an important supply road from Dobropilya to Pokrovsk, which came under the control of Russian FPV drone operators. This complicated rotations, evacuations and deliveries. Soon the Russians went further. In the area of Nowoshakowe, they cut the road from Dobropilia to Konstantinivka. The Ukrainian rear in this area is attacked from the air daily. Rodyńskie and Dobropilia, key logistical points, are regularly bombed with glide bombs and attacked by drones. This was enabled by earlier Russian advances and the movement of operators closer to these cities. Through the first half of July, the Russians did not conduct intensive operations in the direction of Pokrovsk. The situation changed in the second half of the month, when they managed to break through to the city. Attacking from the captured village of Żwirowe, they reached Jubilee Park, from where they set up ambushes on Ukrainian soldiers moving along Defenders of Ukraine Street. Ukrainians reported attempts to push out the Russians and stabilize the situation, but these actions had only a partial effect. According to Ukrainian sources, the breakthrough was possible due to the weakness of forces defending the southern approach to the city. The 32nd Mechanized Brigade allegedly lacked people to man positions, which the Russians exploited, penetrating the city through infiltration by small assault groups. As a result, the situation of the Ukrainian garrison in the Pokrovsk and Myrnograd area is almost catastrophic. It resembles the final stage of fighting for the Russian city of Sudzha, from which Ukrainians had to withdraw after supply roads were cut off. The situation in Pokrovsk is similar, but on a larger scale. All roads leading to the city are now within range of Russian FPV drones, which are the main tool of warfare, and some of them have already been cut off. As Francis Farrell reported, quote, "Every trip in and out of this fortress city in Donetsk Oblast is a roll of the dice with death." Unquote. The Russian offensive may aim to tie down garrisons in combat and prevent their evacuation or providing support to other sectors. If Rodyńskie falls, Ukrainian commanders will have to decide whether to withdraw immediately or risk a bloody retreat under fire. Any delay could lead to Pokrovsk being completely encircled. Meanwhile, the Russians are conducting operations towards Konstantinivka, which is about 45 kilometers away. Fighting is dying down in the cities of Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, which have fallen under Russian control following long and bloody urban battles. To the west of Pokrovsk, the Russian offensive gained less momentum. They captured Poltavka and neighboring Popiv Yar in the second half of July. On the 15th of July, south of Konstantinivka, they took Jablonivka in an attempt to bypass the Kleban-Byk reservoir. They also advanced north of the captured city of Toretsk. This created a threat to Ukrainian positions to the west of Pokrovsk, forcing some units to retreat from Petrivka and Szczerbenivka. Further east, the Russians broke through the defenses and captured Bilahora, almost reaching the suburbs of Konstantinivka. To the east of the city, the situation is more stable. The Ukrainians are effectively defending the area around Chasiv Yar and are blocking the approach to the city from that direction. Although the Russians are unlikely to launch a second major offensive alongside the fighting for Pokrovsk, their current positions allow them to outflank or attack directly. If Pokrovsk falls, Konstantinivka will become the next target. It is a city with a pre-war population of 70,000 people. It is somewhat calmer in the Sieversk direction, where the situation remains relatively stable, despite growing Russian pressure and the loss of some positions east of the city. For both sides, this is still a secondary area, though it might gain importance if the Russians, after potentially capturing Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, shift attention to Słowiańsk and Kramatorsk, which is still unlikely to happen this year. Nevertheless, around July 25th, the Russians conducted an unsuccessful attack using many vehicles. Fighting also continued in Serebryańskie and the Serebryański forest on the northern bank of the Donets River. Further north, the Russians maintained the initiative on both banks of the Żerebec River and in the Kupiansk area, where they are gradually approaching the city, reaching its administrative boundaries. Similar to actions in Kherson Oblast and Zaporozhye, these are auxiliary operations, meant to disperse Ukrainian attention and create pressure that could lead to cracks in the defense. Also, in SumOblast, the situation has partially stabilized. Ukrainian counterattacks enabled the recapture of the villages of Andriivka and Kindrykivka, but on the other hand, the Russians achieved success in Yunakivka. It appears that the Russians are limiting their own operations in this direction. The reason may be both more effective Ukrainian resistance or the achievement of goals in the form of forcing the Ukrainian general staff to transfer additional units to this direction, even if only in the form of assault battalions that were in strategic reserve. And so, Russian advances in Donetsk Oblast are forcing Ukraine to react quickly. The growing disproportion of forces and serious personnel problems mean that stopping the Russian offensive on the current line is becoming increasingly difficult. The extension of the front in the Pokrovsk area exposed shortages in reserves, which enabled the Russians to break into the city. The situation is approaching a critical point. Effective retreat may soon be impossible. Rising losses and tension are causing some commanders to hide the true state of affairs, while higher superiors ignore warnings. This was the case with the 32nd Mechanized Brigade, whose situation was only revealed after its defense was broken through. Therefore, in the face of the growing probability of losing territory, near the current line of fighting, Ukrainians have prepared new fortifications in their rear, which some call the Ukrainian Surovikin Line, which stopped the Ukrainians in Zaporozhye in the summer of 2023. The first new fortifications were built as early as the beginning of March, and since then the Ukrainians have been constantly expanding them. We can see the new Donbas line on this map, which was created and shared with us by ex-platform user Playfra. The new fortifications are to have a final length of about 350 kilometers and have been prepared in several lines, with the main one running north of Dobropilya, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. The pace of Russian advances, as well as the extended range of glide bombs and FPV drones, forced Ukrainians to prepare fortifications several dozen kilometers from the current front line. This does not mean, of course, that areas located south of these fortifications have not been fortified. They are covered by a network of new and old fortifications with varying levels of adaptation to the current battlefield. While the new fortifications along most of their length have been carefully prepared to meet the challenges of the current battlefield for 2025, gaps have been left between fortified positions in some areas, such as in the Bilozerskie Zolotyi Kołodyaz area, which is in the main direction of the Russian offensive operations. These lines have also been prepared in different ways. In some places, they consist of several anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, and barbed wire, while in others, there is only a single anti-tank ditch or dragon's teeth. However, the fortifications are prepared in good positions in terms of topographical location and rely on natural terrain obstacles such as rivers or hills that facilitate defense, with urban areas constituting their direct rear. The trenches for soldiers themselves have also been prepared based on current battlefield experience. They are adapted to the main threat posed by small FPV drones. Instead of trench lines stretching for dozens or hundreds of meters, many independent smaller strongpoints are prepared, which means that the fall of one of them does not lead to the collapse of defense on a section, and is supposed to force the Russians to capture each strongpoint separately. The defensive positions themselves are built along the forest plantings, or in groves, which provides cover from drone attacks and significantly complicates their potential detection. However, it should be remembered that even the best prepared defensive lines will fail if units intended to defend them are weakened and deprived of full manning, and this currently applies to a significant portion of Ukrainian brigades. There is also no doubt that the fact of overwhelming Russian air superiority and intensive bombardments could lead to defensive failures at the least well-prepared and manned positions. At the same time, it is reasonable to assume that the Russians will target the rear of fortified positions directly, attempting to cut them off from supplies by attacking the main access roads with aircraft and FPV drones. The new fortifications are being built outside the borders of Donbas in anticipation of the region's potential fall, which, if it occurs, will not most likely be this year. This means that the new fortifications will not be put to the test for at least a few months. On the one hand, this gives additional time for improvement and supplementation. On the other hand, it may mean that when the time comes, they will be partially outdated and inadequate for the challenges of the modern battlefield, just as the fortifications built in 2014 to 2015 and even in 2022-2023 are often not manned by defenders. And so the war of attrition continues, and the Russian pressure in Donbas is constantly growing, leading to the gradual crumbling of Ukrainian defense, revealing deep problems of the army. Primarily, the chronic lack of infantry to man an increasingly long frontline. Shortages limit the ability to seal emerging gaps. Russian attacks in many directions force Ukraine to disperse reserves, which weakens the most important sectors, especially near Pokrovsk. Multi-directional strikes stretch already overstrained forces, leading to local crises. Meanwhile, the basic problem, lack of people, remains unresolved. As Taras Chmut, president of the Come Back Alive Foundation, admitted in an interview with Ukrainian Pravda, quote, "Our statistics are negative. We are losing more people than we are gaining. We have too few recruits." He added that the reform consisting of creating corps turned out to be fiction. And the main problem is, quote, "There are no more people, there are no more resources, and the war of attrition continues." The Russians are exploiting these shortages, penetrating through the front line with small assault groups and creating local breaches, which they develop in further attacks. Their actions are supported by intensive aviation. 100 to 200 glide bombs are dropped daily. Russia has also engaged thousands of drone operators and recently has gained local advantages in the use of FPV drones. Such tactics allow them to break Ukrainian defense but involve large losses of their own. Nevertheless, the Russians do not slow down, counting that any break will give Ukraine a chance to reorganize and rebuild the front. If the defensive lines being prepared are expanded further in the coming months, and Ukraine possesses the necessary human resources to man them at the moment of trial, then they may allow for overall stabilization of the situation and halt the enemy's advance in the event of potential loss of Donbas. However, this moment has not yet arrived, and the coming months will be characterized by intense fighting in Donbas. This is a region that Russia intends to capture by the end of this year, although this is almost certainly not going to happen in 2025.